All right, people are still filtering in, but we can begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Bashan. Excuse me. I am with the event staff of Politics and Prose. Before we get started with this event, just want to go over a couple of quick items. The first being that at any time during this event, if you would like to ask any direct questions of either of our contributors, we would ask for you to place it in the Q&A box, which you can find towards the bottom of your screen, not the chat section. Separately, in the chat section, you'll be able to find a link which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase a copy of The Whiteness of Wealth. Of course, we highly encourage you to do so, and we would thank you for any of your continued patronage. In The Whiteness of Wealth, Professor Brown draws on decades of cross-disciplinary research to show that tax law isn't as colorblind as she'd once believed. She takes us into her adopted city of Atlanta, introducing us to families across the economic spectrum whose stories demonstrate how American tax law rewards the preferences and practices of white people while pushing Black people further behind. From attending college to getting married to buying a home, Black Americans find themselves at a financial disadvantage compared to their white peers. The results are an ever-increasing wealth gap and more Black families shut out of the American dream. Dorothy A. Brown is an Asa Griggs Candler Professor at Emory University School of Law, a graduate of Fordham University and Georgetown Law. She received her LLM in Taxation from New York University, a nationally recognized scholar in the areas of race, class, and tax policy. She has published dozens of articles, essays, and book chapters on this topic. She has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and NPR, and her opinion pieces have been published in CNN Opinion, Forbes, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. She is joined in conversation by Elie Mystal. Elie is the nation's justice correspondent, an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center, and the legal editor of the More Perfect podcast on the Supreme Court for Radiolab. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School and a former associate at Debevoise and Plimpton. He is a frequent guest on MSNBC and SiriusXM and the author of Allow Me to Retort. Without any further ado, Professor Brown, it's all you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks for having us. Professor Brown, thank you so much for writing this book. Couldn't be more important and more timely and more heartbreaking in lots of ways. I read it and it was kind of like the rich dad, poor dad for Black folks. And there was a lot of it had me feeling like poor dad. But thank you for writing it. Thank you for the original research that went into this work. And I kind of want to start there. By the way, again, as Bashar said, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. We'll try to do this for about 30 minutes and then go to your questions. So please have something waiting for me when I get in there. Okay, so I kind of want to start there with some of the original research here. Look, for those who don't know, one of the dirty little secrets of law school is that tax kids are the smartest, right? Like they have to understand the law just as well as any other field of law, but they've also got to be able to, do some math, which a lot of people go to law school to avoid the math.
Yes.
So they got to do the law, they got to do the math, and they really have to know how to bend the law because that's where you make your money, right? As a tax lawyer, you make your money kind of understanding what the rules are and then figuring out which rules can be bent. But you can't break it or you go to jail. So it's so it's high stakes, very lucrative. A lot of the smarter kind of the just horsepower intellectuals end up kind of gravitating towards tax law. One of the things about tax law is that it is thought to be one of the most objective parts of the law. And your book just puts pain to that lie, that it's not objective at all. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the pushback amongst your tax colleagues? Quite frankly, you're the only Black female tax law professor I think I've ever spoken to in person or virtually.
Yes.
They're not a lot of you.
They're not a lot of us, correct? It's a small club.
What's the pushback within the academia of understanding tax law through the lens of white supremacy and racial injustice?
That's a great question. And the pushback is primarily white law professors telling me it's not race, it's class. So whether so my favorite in quotes comment I received was at a law professor conference, and I'd presented my work that showed Black married couples were more likely to pay higher taxes than white married couples. And at the end of the panel, the first comment was directed at me, and the person said, "Dorothy, everybody knows your work is irrelevant because Blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes." There's this idea that, oh, we're poor and don't pay enough in taxes. So, well, if we say 22% of Black Americans are in poverty, then 78% are not. The vast majority of Black Americans are not poor. But there's this idea from white law professors who know nothing about race to tell a Black woman who's done the research, everybody knows it's irrelevant. It was mind-numbing, to say the least. And I ultimately responded, well, if you're right, what we want is our children to grow up to be poor so they don't pay a lot in taxes. At this point, the room bursts out laughing. And I say, no, we want a lot of income that's either not taxed or subject to a low tax rate. We want to be like Warren Buffett. That's what we want. So it's nonsensical, but I consistently get it's class and not race. Another comment I got when I was presenting my home ownership piece was, oh, Dorothy, that's not race, it's wealth. Wealth isn't race? It's like, I don't even know what to do with these people, right?
The issue, the thing that I think was just jumped off the page to me about the class versus race issue was the research that you did that showed that Black married couples are more likely to be in two income households. And that really struck home to me. Like, I am in a double income household. I am in that classic situation where my wife makes more than I do, somewhat significantly more than I do. She's a lawyer. I am not anymore. So there's that disparity. And we've joked about how it feels like it would be cheaper if I just didn't make any money and just took care of the kids. How like the fact that I make a little bit of money from my writing kind of actually hurts us in some way. We've joked about that. Your research suggests that it's not.
It's not so funny.
My wife's not being funny when she says that.
Exactly, that your wife knows something you didn't know, right?
Right.
So, what my research shows is married Black couples like my parents. My mother was a nurse, my father was a plumber. They earned roughly equal amounts. And some years my father made more than my mother by like a few $100s. In other years, my mother made more than my father, depending on how much overtime my father could get. And I found, based on Census Bureau data, because let me pause here, the IRS does not collect or publish statistics based upon race. That is really important, because if I don't spend the last 25 years being a detective of sorts, you'll never know this story. Okay, so the Census Bureau data that I looked at, which was a proxy for taxable income, showed married Black couples, regardless of household income, were more likely to be in the equal earning category, 50-50, 60-40. It didn't matter. High income, middle income, Black married couples were more likely to have two wage earners that earned income close together. White households, on the other hand, do marriage differently. They tend to have a single wage earner spouse, and the other spouse stays and works at home. The tax law, the joint return, gives that couple, that white couple, single wage earner household, a tax cut, but not the two income earning Black married couple. And for decades, it taxed that Black two wage earning couple more. So it's bad enough they don't get a tax cut. For decades, they paid higher taxes for the privilege of being married.
And it really makes me want to kind of grab the guy who said it's not race, it's class by the scruff, because like what part of the reason for that undoubtedly is class. It's that within your race, you are trying to marry at class. You're trying to, nobody wants to marry down. Certainly my Black wife did not want to marry down, whatever the hell that would have meant. I mean, she did, but that's my witchcraft. But right, there was almost no chance that I was going to marry a woman who couldn't earn. Who didn't have the kind of the skills, the educational background, and the skills to earn that she happened to out earn me. That's just luck. But
Right.
that if you want to talk about, that's where it is. So just that. I
And
guess
it defied the data. I had just presented data that showed, regardless of income, Black households experience marriage differently than white income households. And what he was basically saying is, well, you may have found that in the joint return, but everybody knows everywhere else in the code, Blacks don't pay a lot in taxes. So I wrote a whole book basically saying, we pay a lot in taxes no matter what we do.
All right, I want to jump ahead a little bit in the book, in terms of the book, to really hit upon what I think is one of the issues of the day, and that is student debt.
Yes.
I've written, I know that you said in the green room that you were about to write something about this, about how relieving student debt is a race issue. As much as it's an education issue and a class issue and whatever, that it is fundamentally a race issue when you look at how African-American people are disproportionately affected by high student debt. So can you talk just a little bit about just that chapter in that work, kind of exposing how student debt is really kind of crippling in the Black community?
Yes, absolutely. So it's two pieces. It's the college debt piece, and then what happens when college graduates take their debt-laden degrees into the job market. So I'm going to start with the college debt piece. Well, most Black Americans self-finance their debt. They take out student loans, their parents take out student loans, and when we compare and contrast that with white college students, Black students graduate with higher debt than white students. We also see that's a function of where college students go to college. It's also a function of the fact that 60% of Black Americans who start college don't graduate. A lot of it because of finances, a lot of it because their parents suffered with Jim Crow, a lot of it because the safety net just didn't work. So imagine not graduating, but having all of this debt that you'll never be able to pay off, because the key to college debt is graduating, getting the degree, and then using that degree to get a higher paying job. Well, there's no higher paying job when you don't have the degree. So we have this debt, and tax subsidies do very little on student loan debt. In fact, the maximum interest you can take is $2,500. And God forbid you're Ely or his wife with a law job. You're making too much money, you get zero. So if you make more than 85,000 single or 170,000 married, you don't get any deductions. But if you make less, then up to $2,500 of your interest is deductible. Well, what my research showed is in the early years, most Black Americans, or the typical Black American, has so much debt, they won't be able to take all of their interest. It exceeds $2,500. And now the kicker, God forbid two Black college students marry each other. Individually, they each get up to $2,500 of an interest deduction. When they get married, the unit gets $2,500 of interest deduction. So you're losing out on half of what you could take the day before you got married. So tax subsidies do very little to help you pay off your debt. But let's assume, unlike the 60% that don't graduate, you're the 40%, you graduate, and then you take your degree into the labor market. But before we get there, one other thing. Wealthy Black parents are unable to protect their children from student loan debt the way white wealthy parents are. Why? Because the Black wealthy have their assets held differently than the white wealthy. Black wealthy have a higher percentage in their home, which is a pretty illiquid asset. And even if you want to do a home equity loan, Black homes in racially diverse neighborhoods or all Black neighborhoods are not worth as much. Your home equity loan will be much smaller than your wealthy white peer. Also, wealthy white Americans are more likely to own stock that they can sell quickly and pay for their children's debt. A lower percentage of Black Americans own stock. So even Black wealthy Americans. Go ahead.
And just let me throw in just right there, because it's also later in your book about how often even upper middle class, financially secure Black family, while they're supposed to be helping their kids through college, they're also helping their parents through their retirement, because their parents don't have the retirement savings, the safety net that a white parent might have to. And it's just much more common in the Black community to kind of not put your parents in a home.
That's right.
So, my mother lives with me.
Yep.
She just retired, by the way. Congratulations to her. But so that's also that is money that has to be spread around. I forget how you say it, but and so often, if you are the successful Black person in your family, you are the successful Black person in your family, and you have an obligation to help the rest of your family kind of smooth over some rough patches. And that's money that can't just be laser focused, reinvested into your children's college education.
Yes, you have the research that shows Black college graduates are more likely to send money home to parents and grandparents. White college graduates are more likely to receive money from parents and grandparents that enable them to build wealth. They use it as a down payment. They use it to pay off their student loans. Grandma pays for their child's K through 12 private tuition. So we see white family wealth building that works perfectly and is subsidized by tax policy. Those gifts and inheritances, tax-free. The payments you make to grandma or your parents or your sibling, no tax break for you. So we have Black college graduates with more financial burdens than their white peer who may be sitting at the next cubicle. And the Black employee is scratching their head going, why can they do all that and I can't do a fraction of it? Well, this is why, because they're getting financial support from their family and they're not talking about it.
And that's even in the situation where the employment outcome was equal. And you also talk about how so often that employment outcome is not equal. My job coming out of a top Ivy League school is going to be, statistically speaking, a less good job than my white colleague's job coming out of the same school.
Yes, research shows that a Black college grad from Harvard and a white college grad from Harvard, the Black grad has to send out more resumes in order to get asked for an interview. And when they are invited to interview, they are invited to interview for a lower paying position than the one they applied to and the one that was offered for their white peer. And it starts the least difference between the white and Black resume interviews are at the selective institutions. The further down you go selective wise, the more resumes Black Americans have to send out, the harder it is. So with white Americans, there isn't that much of a difference between highly selective and selective. With Black Americans, it's significantly different.
Which is interesting because white Americans are also the ones willing to grease the tables to get those kids into the more. And it's like, you don't need it. You don't like.
You really don't. You can afford to go to a less expensive school and your child will be just fine.
I tell my friends all the time, Dartmouth is a good school. Like, you're going to be fine.
Yes, you're going to be fine. Okay, it's not Harvard, but you're going to be fine. Yes.
So a big part of this book is that I really want people to understand, and everybody should buy the book and read it and all that. None of this by accident, right? This is not like 3 or 4 guys sitting in a room with a calculator coming up with rules and, oh my God, it happens to hurt Black people. Who could have known? Like, there's intentionality behind our tax code.
And what we have is a tax system shaped by white Americans. So the joint return we got because a rich white couple named the Seaborns wanted to pay less in taxes. We got the exclusion for gain on sale of a home because Congress and the realtors wanted to make it easy for people to sell their homes without having to pay taxes to move across the country for the defense industry. In the 1950s, who was being hired in the defense industry in 1950s? It wasn't my parents. It wasn't your parents, okay? It was white people's parents. So there's nothing in the tax law that says blacks pay more. There's nothing in that legislative history that said blacks pay more. But what we know is in 1951, for the first time, more than half of white Americans are homeowners. So this tax break for home ownership was always about helping white homeowners. So we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, the modern progressive tax system dates back to 1913, okay? A lot of these laws date back, the exclusion for gifts and inheritances, that dates back to 1913. Who had property that they could make gifts and inheritances for in 1913? You know who, right? So in 1913, the only people who paid taxes were rich white Americans. When I tell this to my students, they like scream, "What, are you nuts? What? There was a time when only rich people paid taxes?" Yeah, there was a time when only rich people paid taxes.
And they got the tax laws shaped towards their benefit.
Yes.
Specifically when it comes to marriage. So your whole story about the marriage penalty, the marriage bonus turned to penalty, turned to bonus for some, that whole story was new to me. And I'll admit to listeners, I only got a B in tax, so maybe that's why it was new. But
man, you wouldn't have gotten this in tax. If you didn't take me, you wouldn't have gotten it.
Okay, that makes me feel better. But that whole story was fascinating to me. And you know, the thing that, again, jumped off the page to me was how the marriage laws, the marriage tax laws, are really centered on this idea of a traditional household where you have one high-earning male and a stay-at-home, non-earning wife.
Yes.
And you talk about how that is just not the reality in Black households because, I'm going to quote you here, Black women work.
Yes, we do. And Black wives have always, Black women have always worked, right? We came here in chains, they put us to work, right? Black wives have always worked to a higher percentage as white wives. But here's what's really interesting about the marriage penalty bonus. So the marriage bonus is when two people get married and they get a tax cut from what they would have paid had they remained single. The marriage penalty is two people get married and their taxes go up compared to what they would have paid had they remained single. For years, for decades, we had a marriage penalty that was pretty robust. I'm going to tell a story about the Trump tax cuts that minimized the marriage penalty. And you best believe it's not to help out Black people, but I don't want to get ahead of the story, okay? So what we have is, when the joint return came into being, at least 80% of white Americans were destined to get a bonus, a tax cut when they got married, because they were in the Leave It to Beaver household. At that time, Black couples were not in the same position because Black wives always contribute significantly more to household income. They were working and contributing more to household income. So for decades, we had Black couples paying higher taxes. So I started looking at this based on the 1990 census. And I found a category of white households in the 60,000 to 90,000 that were more likely to pay a penalty than get a bonus. So I thought, this is interesting. You want to watch this. Over time, the percentage of white married couples in the penalty category grew. So in 2016, the Treasury put out a report that said 51% of all married couples got a bonus. They, of course, didn't do anything by race, but I'm going to tell you, that's mainly white people, right? 40% of all married couples were paying a penalty. That's a lot of Black people, but that's also white people. And then 9%, their taxes didn't change. Well, the Trump tax cuts eliminated the marriage penalty for everybody but anyone eligible for the earned income tax credit and anyone in like a 600,000 or higher household. He didn't do that because Black people were paying it. He did it because people who worked for him and people in Congress are now in a category where both spouses are working and contributing a significant amounts and paying a penalty. And there's no legislative history in the Trump tax cuts as to why the marriage penalty was temporarily fixed. And my argument is, it's to help white people because we got it the worst, but they were getting dragged in over time.
Yeah, that's a good way to change any law in America, make white people experience it, and suddenly, we have
it's a problem. We have to fix this.
I mean, maybe we need universal health care now that white people are going broke from health care. Like it happens again and again and again. I'm going to ask something a little bit more philosophical. So a lot of your prescriptions for what to do about this kind of unfairness and injustice revolves around concepts of neutrality. For the marriage penalty, don't penalize marriages, don't bonus marriages, just treat them as neutral. For housing policy, just treat renters and home buyers the same, neutrality. Does that suggests to me that you take a dim view as to the tax code's ability to shape behavior, which philosophically speaking is different because there are a lot of people who think the tax code does by its very nature and should shape behavior. It should reward things that we want to reward and penalize things that we want to penalize. You seem to have a different view. You really don't seem to like it when the tax code tries to pick winners and losers.
Because they tend to pick white winners and Black losers, right? So my tax code would pick Black winners and white losers, but we don't have my tax code. In fact, one of the suggestions I make is a reparations tax credit. It's designed to compensate Black taxpayers who for decades pay higher taxes. But I'm a lawyer and I know that's going to be held unconstitutional. So that's never going to stand up to scrutiny, although that's my first choice. My second choice is a wealth tax credit, which would apply to any taxpayer with below median wealth income, which means Black taxpayers will disproportionately benefit because of the racial wealth gap, but white taxpayers will, and Latinx taxpayers and indigenous. So everybody would benefit from this, which is why I believe the Supreme Court would find it constitutional. So, I don't know that I think tax subsidies should get out of the homeownership business because the homeownership business is racist, okay? And unless you're going to intervene in a way to disrupt the racism. Okay, so when you're an academic, you get to write articles with crazy solutions. They don't wind up in trade press books. So I'm going to tell you the solution I came up with in my homeownership scholarship before I wrote this book. It was you only got a mortgage interest deduction if you lived in a neighborhood with more than 10% Black neighbors. So that meant Black homeowners, for the most part, would get a tax break, but most white homeowners wouldn't. Well, that wouldn't be found constitutional. But if it were, that would be my way to use the tax code to compensate Black Americans for the real harm they are experiencing in the homeownership market that the federal government played a racist role in historically. So I want marriage to not impact your taxes because what I know now is the way the joint return is written, Black people are not going to get tax cuts that white people are. Well, how do I fix that? Get out of the business of rewarding or punishing people who get married. So you're right. It seems like I'm going for a neutral position, but it's because the law won't allow me to go for a pro-Black position. So for the jobs chapter, I suggest corporations are required to audit themselves and determine if they are paying equal wages to their Black and white employees. They're given 3 to 5 years. If they don't get it together within then, I advocate to deny them a wage deduction. I think that could encourage behavior. So there are instances where I think I can encourage behavior, but when I know what societal racism does, it requires 2 incomes in Black families and 1 in whites, then I just say, here's the fix, just get out of it. Let the federal government get out of it.
I'm going to pigeonhole you a little bit more on the reparations question, because it's a question that we have in our chat too. So how do you see the tax code and how it can be used as a reparations light kind of vehicle?
So
and also expand a little bit on the unconstitutionality of it.
Yes,
because I think that's important. Like,
it is.
People with law degrees understand. Like, when we say that something's unconstitutional, I'm not. When I say something, I'll start by speaking for me. When I say something is unconstitutional, that's not me saying because John Roberts will think it's unconstitutional, because damn near everything that I want, John Roberts will think is unconstitutional. That's me saying, like, even I probably think that it might be unconstitutional to just give money to people if they live around, right? So, like, can you just pull out a little bit more how the tax code can be used for reparations, and what some of the obvious, like, where you obviously fall off the cliff?
Right. So I wrote the book, and it showed for decades, Black Americans like my parents paid higher taxes because they were Black. There has to be a remedy for that. The obvious remedy would be what I call a reparations tax credit that would basically allow them to pay less in taxes every April 15th to compensate for all the extra taxes they paid. The law would say, well, if you're only giving this break to Black people, you have to show that tax law actively, intentionally discriminated against Black people. You would have to show that when you went to the rate tables, there was 1 for whites and 1 for Blacks. You can't show that because that's not how it worked. So the government would say, oh, I never intended to discriminate against Black people. I was just trying to help the majority of Americans who were homeowners, or the majority of Americans who were married. And that BS response would be accepted by the Supreme Court. So I wouldn't have a leg to stand on to justify targeting tax relief solely to Black people.
Yeah.
But
although
I know
that would be a good solution. I mean,
it's the perfect solution.
It's also my wife's favorite solution to this problem as well.
It's the perfect solution because Black people were targeted. Why can't we target them with relief?
And it gets through the knotty problem of where's the money coming from? Well, guess what?
Right.
It doesn't have to come from anywhere. We don't have to print more money. We just
That's right.
just take the government's foot off the neck of Black people for 50 years, like you had it on the foot of Black people for 150.
But I digress, Ely says, right? No, I know. So I know that the reparations tax credit is ideal, and who knows? I honestly believe we may get a Supreme Court one day that would find my reparations tax credit constitutional. We're just not there yet. We are really not there yet. Okay. But I know there's this thing called the racial wealth gap. So if I come up with a wealth credit that applies to everyone regardless of race, the only qualification you need is below median wealth. And I know like 80% of Black Americans have below median white wealth. This will disproportionately benefit Black Americans while also helping low wealth white Americans. And that the Supreme Court would find acceptable because wealth or economic discrimination is easier to pull off. You can discriminate on the basis of wealth. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race.
That leads to a question that we have in here about Senator Warren. The question is wondering if Senator Warren's wealth tax would address racial inequalities. I wanted to bring up Warren because you actually had some praise for her, but also some shade for her. So I wanted you to kind of unpack where the Warren Sanders wing of the Democratic Party is on this, because I think your book does a really good job of not giving the white liberals too much of a pass here.
I don't think I gave them any passes
on some of their policies that, while yes, are less kind of like evil than the Republican policies would be, like still do not always address the racial issues with the intentionality needed. So can you talk a little bit about what you think of Warren's wealth tax, but then more generally, what you think of the progressive left needs to kind of do better on this issue?
So I think Warren's wealth tax is a great idea. It's interesting when we have these conversations about wealth taxes, we don't talk about race. When we're really, a wealth tax is going to be disproportionately paid by white people, right? There are Black wealthy people, but what she's talking about, we don't have a lot of Black folks in that wealth category. So it's going to be
Oprah
like,
would have to pay that.
right, okay, Oprah and maybe one other person, right? So I was just about to say, like 98% of this wealth tax, I predict, would be paid by white Americans, okay? So I support the wealth tax. And then it's a question of what are you going to do with the money? Because it's to argue against the wealth tax is a ridiculous argument because she sets it at such a high amount. It's like, really? You don't want to pay 2 cents over 50 million? Like, really? Okay, I'm embarrassed for you at this point. So, I totally support it. Now, the progressive left really doesn't get race. Like, I think Senator Warren gets race. In fact, I put on a conference in 2004 when I was on the faculty at Washington and Lee, and Senator Warren came and presented a race and bankruptcy piece that blew us all away. And she will say that was the first time she ever dealt with race in bankruptcy. That was 2004. She's been dealing with this for a while. So she's got, every time she was on the stump, she would talk about systemic racism. She, better than most, gets systemic racism. But there was one part, if I remember correctly, where she was talking about healthcare and access and for maternal deaths, and it was encouraging people to have access to hospitals. And I think one of the things I said was, giving people access to a racist healthcare system doesn't solve the problem, right? So it's sometimes a blind spot, but I don't put her in the typical category of the progressive left because she actually talks about race. Most progressive white left people do not. They talk about class. Here we go again, right? And if they talk about race discrimination, it's historical.
Yes.
It's not 21st century. It's not all those law professors I presented my home ownership piece to and told me it wasn't race. And I would ask them, how many Black people live in your neighborhood? And we would stare at each other for a minute, okay? It's like 0, but you're so good on the issues. So the progressive left doesn't do a good job of grappling with 21st century race discrimination that is being perpetuated by good white people.
And you see that so often. Your book talks about how they choose to live, the kinds of communities they choose to live in. I thought one of the most sobering aspects of that, this is the home ownership chapter now, I believe, was how you explain how there's no accounting just for other people's racism, and how so many Black choices are circumscribed and limited by what white people themselves are going to do. So that there was no evidence that, for instance, housing values would go down if you had a Black person move it. There's no evidence that me being Black in my predominantly white neighborhood lowers housing values. What there is evidence is that white people, if they have the choice between living next to me or not, will choose not 9 times out of 10. Yes. And that if enough white people just refuse to live next to me, well, then eventually the housing price in my area will go down because they can't compete for white business. But that's not because of me. It's because white people don't want me as a neighbor, which is weird because I'm a really nice neighbor.
And I'm also gonna tell you, I got this argument from a left group of people. And the argument was, well, Dorothy, I don't think it's virulent racism as to why white people don't want to live next to Black people. I think they're afraid of their property values. And I responded, what you're doing is centering whiteness. And what I'm telling you is, as a Black homeowner, I don't care if the reason my house doesn't appreciate is because you're not a virulent racist, if you are behaving exactly like a virulent racist. It was like, then there was silence. But don't tell me, well, I'm not a bad person. I don't care. My home value is affected by what you're doing, and you can stop it.
I call what you just said, I call that the black turning test. If a reasonable black person cannot tell the difference between an actual racist and one who's just pretending to be racist, it doesn't matter.
I don't care. I don't care. Exactly. I don't care. You care. I don't care.
Another question here that I want to get to. The question I'm going to summarize. It's basically about imputed value, and the questioner is asking if it would help to kind of include the imputed value of housework into the tax policy. You have a great section about how even if we do that, that's still not going to be enough. So I wanted you to get a chance to answer that one.
So yes, right now that stay-at-home spouse is contributing.
Sorry, Professor. I didn't do a good job of hosting. So imputed value is trying to, that concept means we understand that people who work in the home, predominantly wives, are contributing economic value. There are models that one could pull out of the hat to try to put an economic dollar figure on that work, the imputed value, and then tax, then either tax break or tax whatever, treat that as a taxable good, and kind of work off of that. So that's the concept of imputed value. But sorry, now.
No. So the stay-at-home spouse, if they were working for a third party, they would be getting wages and they'd be taxed on it. What our tax system does is ignore the value of that labor. And that household that, like I used an example earlier, let's say somebody makes $100,000, they're the sole wage earner, they have a stay-at-home spouse. The stay-at-home spouse may be contributing $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of services. They're not taxed on it. So, an in-between solution might be taxing on the value of those services, but it still doesn't get at the fact that when married white people get married, they get a tax cut and Black Americans do not. So yes, taxing imputed labor would help, although it's complicated as hell. And I tend to believe simple is better. So I think the solution is to just have everybody file single, and the stay-at-home spouse, doesn't have any taxable income. He is going to pay higher taxes because now $100,000 is taxed not as married, but as single, and it's going to be higher.
Here's a question, and again, I want to summarize a little bit, but it's kind of asking, now that we understand that there's this difference in how kind of Black families organize versus white families, the question is kind of, why do you think that is? So the questioner, do you think that the fact that the U.S. is founded on stolen labor of African descendants, where the descendants of the slaves did not start off with great wealth, necessitated that most Black families be comprised of two wage earners? Like, why do you think we're in this situation where Black families have kind of organized themselves the way that they seem to?
So there are a couple of reasons. One is the racist labor market, the anti-Black labor market that prevents Black men from earning what white men earn, right? So let's start there. And then if that's not good enough, you can also, there's also literature that says married Black couples do marriage differently than married white couples. And it's a chicken and an egg problem, because part of it is married Black couples are more partners, function more like partners in decision-making than white married couples. And you could understand how that could be. If I'm contributing half and you're contributing half, you're not telling me what to do with the money. It's our money and we're gonna talk about it. If somebody over here is contributing 100%, we ain't got to talk about it because you do it my way or there's a door, right? So the model of marriage for Black is very different than white Americans. But also a piece of this is the labor market that not only doesn't pay Black men what it pays Black women, white men, but Black men have higher unemployment rates. So there's this tenuous nature of Black men in the labor market. So if you're two Black folks getting married, you recognize this and you expect, well, I, as a woman, assuming it's a heterosexual marriage, it could be same sex, but I'm going to work because I don't know when my husband might get laid off because their unemployment rates are higher. So, is that a function of slavery, descendants of slaves that didn't get our 40 acres and a mule? We don't know, because we don't know what Black marriage would look like if Black men could make what white men could make. I think it's an interesting thought experiment, but we don't know.
I also, and I think that's, I mean, look, that's, to me, that's the basic point. Like the inability of Black men to earn as their white counterparts completely changes the playing field. And not just the tenuous nature of Black male employment, but the randomness at which Black men can be fired in this country.
Yes.
Just warps the playing field. But I think in part because of those two factors, I think there's also something to be said for, again, this line that just, Black women work. Like, Black women are brought up to understand that they will have to earn a wage,
living,
doing something. The thought that you're going to be a Black woman and then go to school to find a husband who's then going to take care of you for the rest of your life, like that's just not a path that is open to Black women, right? That's just not something that that's not what they teach them in home ec.
Yeah, I didn't get that. I didn't get that from Miss Dottie. Okay, just saying. Okay, my mother didn't tell me that. Yes.
Right. So when you add in the fact that you have lower just wage earning from Black males, and then the fact that you have a cultural assumption that Black women are gonna have to work their whole lives anyway, like it leads to a different kind of system. But I think exactly we don't know what it might have led to. If you take out factors A, B, and C, would D be different? Yeah, probably.
Right. That's right. Probably.
Do you think that there's any optimism? I want to combine two questions here. So one is just, how do we get the census to the IRS to start keeping track of this along racial lines? And I think what links up with that question is this one. Do you have any reason for optimism in Biden's tax policies? Like, we know what the Trump government was.
Right.
Does 100 days in, does the Biden government look better? How can it be better? Like, what are your thoughts on him so far?
And those two questions really are related, because President Biden's first executive order was about racial equity, and it was about racial equity across all federal agencies, including the Treasury, which is over the IRS. And in that executive order, he wants, one of the parts of it is data disaggregation by race and other things. But I want to focus on the race piece. And there is a requirement that on this data disaggregation, think statistics by race group, the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy is on that data working group. So that should give me lots of optimism, but it doesn't, because the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy has never written anything about race. She has written about wealth. She's written about inequality, which are things clearly based on race, but nothing about race. So I think the Biden administration is very committed to getting us these race and tax statistics, but I think they need to pay attention to the people they've put in these agencies who are not really the best folks to carry this out. So what can we do? We can agitate. We could let our members of Congress know. Anytime we see a Biden administration member talk about tax policy, we need to be thinking about, well, where's the race impact? Do you do a race impact, right? Send them an email, ask the question. If we've got any reporters on here, you need to be asking the question of the Biden administration, do they have the right people in these positions to get this racial equity order implemented? So I'm optimistic, but what is it? Trust but verify. I'm like, I think we need to do a little more pushing from the outside.
What are your thoughts on this? Is from a audience member, what are your thoughts on taxing wages at more favorable rates than income produced by capital assets? You have a lot in your book about just, I mean, and this is the part that I did know, right? Just about the about the different taxation rates, basically that disfavor how Blacks earn their money through wage versus how wealthy white families earn their money through assets. How can you talk a little about that disparity, and then how do we go about kind of changing it?
Yes. So I say you should not pay higher taxes when you work for your money than when your money works for you. We should have one tax rate system that applies, whether it's income from labor, your wages, or income from stock, capital gains. Right now, we have a low preferential rate that applies to stock ownership. And most Black Americans don't own stock in that way. So that is a giveaway to white Americans, and it's a giveaway disproportionately to higher income white Americans. So we need tax reform that would tax all income the same way. It's like, it's ridiculous. So what do I think of it? I think it's a bad idea. And the hero of this story could be Ronald Reagan, because his 1986 Tax Reform Act required income from stock to be taxed at the same rate as income from wages. So when anybody starts to say that's socialism, excuse me, I don't think Ronnie was. So we have models to do this. We just need the political will, and we need the public getting upset about taxes, something you don't want to think about, but getting upset and demanding change.
If I could push back for a second, though, and this is me kind of just,
Yeah.
let's pretend I'm Black Republican today.
Yes.
All right, so I got the Black Republican hat on. Well, shouldn't Blacks just invest more in the stock market? Don't we want Black people to invest in the stock market? Doesn't having this disparity encourage them to invest in the stock market? Blah blah blah. The market always provides.
Yes.
I'm not a very good Black Republican, but you know what they mean.
Yes.
Like, you know, how, and you do talk about how there is kind of a distrust of the stock market from lots of Black people. But how do you answer the criticism, the pushback that, well, we actually do want Black people to spend more in the stock market and earn more money that way?
So first, I'll say we have this low preferential rate, and very few Black Americans are investing in the stock market. So we have it, and it's not working out for Black people. So let's look at reality, right? Let's look at the fact that it ain't happening. But if you want it to happen, then I think the burden is on the financial services industry to look at Black people as potential customers, which they don't do. So I actually, in the book, argue for investing in the stock market. Taxing income from stock the same way as income from labor is not an anti-stock ownership position. It's reflecting that we should not be making tax policy for like 5% of Black people. We should be making tax policy for most Black people. So I think investing in the stock market is something we need to consider, because there isn't the same race penalty the way there is in our homes. There aren't Black stocks and white stocks that white people can avoid the Black stocks, right? There's just stocks. So I think there is something to be said for investing in the stock market, but I also think the responsibility lies with the financial services industry that does not look on us as potential customers.
I want to get you out here on this. It's the question that I had when I finished the book. It's the question this audience member had too. How does a Black married family navigate the tax code and the tax laws after learning this information? Because that was the thing, like, this book hit me, it was triggering, let's like that, right? Because you kind of read it and you're just like, oh yeah, I make that mistake. Oh yeah, that happens to me. Wah, wah. Like, how, like armed with knowledge.
Yes.
How do we apply it? What does the individual Black family do to apply this knowledge to their own situation?
So first of all, married filing separately is going to cost you more, so that's not a choice. You're married, you're going to get screwed. We have to deal with it until we fix it. It's all the other things. It's where you buy a home. So in the last chapter of my book, I give advice, defensive advice for Black Americans, because we're in a system designed to strip us of wealth and not build wealth. And let's start with home ownership. The biggest asset most Black Americans have is their home. Well, now you know if you buy a home in an all-white neighborhood, it's going to appreciate. If you buy a home in an all-Black or racially diverse neighborhood, it's not going to appreciate so much. Be intentional. I'm not telling you to go buy the house in the white neighborhood or go buy the house in the Black neighborhood. I'm saying when you do it, be conscious of that decision and then take precautions. So if you buy a house in an all-white neighborhood, you can be house poor. You can put all your money into that house because it's going to appreciate. Never, ever, ever be house poor in a racially diverse or all-Black neighborhood. Buy less house. Buy less house, max out on your retirement. If you have a job that comes with an employer-provided retirement account, max out on it. If you don't have a job that comes with a retirement account, set up your own retirement account, because you're not spending all your money on your home. So set up retirement accounts, think about, and you say, with what money, Dorothy? You just told me if I'm a college graduate, I'm sending money home to my parents, I'm sending money home to my siblings. What are you talking about? Well, my mother had this rule. Every time she got a raise, she would put it in her retirement account. And this was her argument. The day before you got the raise, you didn't have the money. So act like you still don't have the money. So you could, the next time, who knows when any of us are ever getting another raise. But assuming we do get another raise, that money you could put in your retirement account. That money you could start a 529 savings account for your kids' college. So it's about planning ahead and not saying, well, I guess the answer is I should buy a house in an all-white neighborhood. And I'm like, hold up, wait a minute. Because you may have your neighbor call the cops on you when you try to get in your house. If you've got any children, their kids, your children, your Black children are going to be targeted by teachers. The same behavior they engage in, that white kids engage in, Black kid gets called to the principal office, gets suspended. There are all kinds of issues. I have friends who deal with this, and they are Harvard educated lawyers. So I pity the school, okay? Because my friends are not having it, but they have to be vigilant. So a good financial investment means you have to be diligent over the care and feeding of your children, over yourself. So we're always between a rock and a hard place. So it's about being smarter, knowing you're between a rock and a hard place.
The only thing I would add to that is, and I co-sign everything you just said. The only thing I would add to that is, financial planning is not just for white people.
No,
having a financial planner is not just for white people. It's actually worth the money to go and sit down to talk to a guy who's going to do your taxes for you, who's going to sit down and map out your retirement. It's worth it to talk to Chuck. It's actually worth it to do that, as opposed to doing it all yourself, doing it on Quicken, taking the standard deduction, and just being happy you got through another tax season. For the marginal increase in cost, and it really is marginal when you put, it's not that much more money to have your taxes professionally done. Even if your first step is just to have your taxes professionally done by an accountant, that then starts to build the relationship with that accountant, who later you can go back to with some, if you trust them, if you get a good feeling about them, that you can go back to with actual financial questions. Because not everybody is going to know off the top of their head.
I agree with that.
What a 529 is, what a 401k, but these people are paid to know that and are paid to tell you that. And it's worth it to pay them that extra little bit of money just to, you don't have to see them more than, once a year. But
once a year, you can handle it. Once a year, you can do it.
Right? It's worth it. So, Professor Brown, thank you so much for this book, for this work. Thank you so much for this talk. Thank you all of those who came out to listen. Please buy the book, Whiteness of Wealth. It's really good, and knowledge is power. And this book will literally make you think about the financial decisions you're making, and hopefully allow you to make better ones.
Thank you.
On behalf of Politics and Prose, I'd like to thank both of our contributors for this wonderful and enlightening discussion. And of course, I'd like to thank you out there, the audience, for tuning in and your continued support. Want to wish you all well and tell everyone to stay well read. Have a good one, everyone.